The frost was still on the fence wire when Elias Vanderberg heard the truck. It wasn't the milk hauler, it wasn't the feed delivery either. This truck came from the wrong direction, rattling down the gravel county road with a bed full of something that clanged like church bells falling down a staircase. Elias set his coffee mug on the porch rail and walked out to the edge of his 80 acres. The same 80 acres his great-grandfather Willem had broken with a horse-drawn plow back in 1911, after crossing the Atlantic from a village outside Zwolle, with nothing but a trunk of tools and a Bible with the family names written in the front cover. The truck stopped at the property line, right where his hayfield met the back lot of Meridian Alloy Works, the stamping plant that had gone up 11 years earlier, on what used to be the Hendricks place. Two men in coveralls didn't even look his way. They tipped the bed, and out came a landslide of twisted steel, bent rebar, curled sheet metal, gear housings, and what looked like the guts of an old conveyor system, all of it crashing onto the low end of his north field. The field wasn't fenced there. It never needed to be. That corner had always been soft, half swamp, good for nothing but cattails and the occasional deer bedding down in summer. By the time Elias got there on foot, the truck was already pulling a U-turn, gravel spitting from the tires. "That's my land," he said, to no one, because the men were already gone. His wife Cornelia came out onto the porch in her robe, arms crossed against the cold, and asked what all the noise had been. When he told her, she didn't say much at first. She'd married into this farm 39 years earlier, and she'd learned long before that Elias processed trouble the same way he processed weather, by walking out into it rather than watching it from a window. She poured him a second cup of coffee, handed it to him at the door, and told him not to do anything rash before breakfast. It was, in hindsight, good advice, though it would take him nearly 2 years to fully follow it. Here is a fact that surprises most people who've never lived next to industry. Dumping scrap on someone else's property line, even by a few feet, even just this once, is not a rare accident. It happens when overworked plant managers are told to clear a loading yard by Friday and nobody double-checks the surveyor's pins from 40 years back. Elias called the plant that same afternoon. He got transferred twice, put on hold once, and was told, politely, that someone would look into it. Nobody looked into it. Not that week, not that month. What Elias did instead was walk the pile. He was 61 years old, a man who had spent 4 decades reading soil the way other men read stock tickers, knowing, before agronomists could tell him, when a field was tired, when it needed a season of clover instead of corn, when the earthworm count was dropping and the ground was starting to compact into something closer to concrete than farmland. He had grown up watching his father test drainage with a shovel and a pocket full of patience, and what he saw in that pile, once the shock wore off, was not garbage. It was iron, it was steel, it was history, stacked 12 feet high, glinting where the December sun caught a bent gear tooth or the curve of an old boiler jacket. Most people think rust is decay, plain and simple, a metal dying. That's only half true, and it matters for what comes next in this story. When iron reacts with oxygen and moisture, it forms iron oxide, the reddish-brown compound we call rust. Left alone, ordinary steel keeps oxidizing indefinitely, flaking away layer by layer until nothing structural is left. But there's a category of steel, developed in the 1930s and used widely by outdoor sculptors and architects since the 1960s, called weathering steel, trademarked as Core 10. When this alloy rusts, the oxide layer that forms is dense and tightly bonded to the metal beneath it. Instead of flaking off, it seals itself, protecting the interior steel from further corrosion for decades. That burnt orange, almost leathery skin you see on outdoor sculptures and some bridges isn't neglect, it's armor that finished growing. Elias didn't know the trademark name that first week, but he knew, from replacing enough machinery shed roofing over the years, that some rust protects and some rust destroys, and the difference is mostly about density, alloy content, and whether the metal is ever allowed to fully dry between wet seasons. That knowledge would matter more than he expected. He spent the better part of a Saturday just standing at the edge of the pile with a notepad, the way he used to walk a new field before deciding what to plant in it. He sorted, in his head, what looked structurally sound from what looked ready to crumble. A stack of stamping dies near the bottom had already gone the bad kind of rust, flaking into orange dust that stained his gloves. But a cluster of old conveyor rollers near the top, exposed to sun and wind rather than standing water, had that dense, almost leathery skin he recognized from an old plow disc his grandfather had left leaning against the barn for 60 years without ever rusting through. Nature, it turned out, had already been sorting the pile for him. He just had to learn to read it. There was a real concern buried under the aesthetics, and it deserves its own honest moment in this story, because glossing over it would do a disservice to every farmer watching who has dealt with something similar. Scrap metal, especially from a stamping and alloy plant, isn't inert. Old machine housings can carry residues of cutting oil, zinc coating, cadmium plating, or lead-based paint from decades-old equipment. When metal like that sits directly on soil for months, especially in a low, wet corner of a field, heavy metals can leach downward with rainwater, altering soil chemistry and, in enough concentration, making that patch unsafe for food crops or grazing. Elias called the county extension office before he called a lawyer, a soil scientist named Petra Dijkstra, no relation despite the name. Half of West Michigan seemed to descend from the same 3 Dutch shipping manifests, drove out with a soil probe and a case of sample bags. She took cores at 6-inch intervals down to 2 feet, at 12 points radiating out from the pile. The results took 3 weeks. Elevated zinc and trace cadmium near the pile's center, dropping off sharply within about 40 feet, well within the boundary of the low, unfarmed corner. Nothing had migrated into the hayfield itself, but the plant, facing a real liability now that testing existed on paper, offered Elias 2 things: a settlement check and, if he wanted it, a standing offer to keep the scrap as compensation, since hauling 12 tons of assorted metal back out would cost more than the metal itself was worth on the commodity market. Most men would have taken the check and called it closed. Elias asked for a shovel, a pair of gloves, and 6 weeks. The first thing he planted wasn't grass seed, it was sunflowers, and this wasn't sentiment, it was chemistry. And it's one of the more remarkable facts in modern agriculture that deserves more attention than it gets. Sunflowers, along with certain mustards and Indian mustard in particular, are what soil scientists call hyperaccumulators. Their root systems draw heavy metals up out of the soil at rates far higher than most plants, storing the metals in their stalks and leaves rather than letting them pass into groundwater. It's the same principle that lets sunflowers be used, famously, in fields near the Chernobyl exclusion zone and later near Fukushima, to help draw radioactive cesium and other contaminants out of topsoil. The process is called phytoremediation, and while it isn't instant, it can take multiple growing seasons to bring contamination down meaningfully. It works with the land instead of stripping it, and it leaves something beautiful standing while it does the work. Elias planted 4 rows of sunflowers around the perimeter of the low corner that first spring, more as a barrier and a slow filter than a cure. Petra Dijkstra came back twice that summer to test leaf tissue and confirm the plants were, in fact, pulling zinc up out of the ground, the way the research said they should. And while the sunflowers worked underground, Elias started clearing the pile from the top down. He wasn't a welder, not yet. What he had was a grinder, a torch he'd used for 20 years on broken plowshares, and an old friend named Bram Kosteris, who'd retired from Meridian Alloy Works itself 2 years before the dumping and still had his welding certification current, out of stubbornness more than anything. The first thing they built, almost as a joke between 2 men easing the tension of a bad year, was a rooster. It stood on a fence post at the edge of the cleared ground, built from a curved conveyor guard for the body, 2 rusted gear housings for the wings, and the coiled spring from a broken hay baler for the tail feathers, fanned out and welded one at a time until it caught the wind like real feathers might. It took them 9 days, working evenings after chores. When Elias's granddaughter, visiting from Grand Rapids for a weekend, saw it standing against the sunset, she didn't ask why there was a metal rooster in the swamp corner of the farm. She asked if they could make a horse next. Cornelia, who had spent 40 years keeping the household ledger balanced to the penny, took one look at the rooster and said what Elias himself had been thinking but hadn't said aloud, that it was the first thing to come off that pile of trouble that had actually made her smile. She started keeping a small notebook of her own after that, sketching rough shapes for what the scrap in the yard might become before Elias and Bram ever picked up the torch, a habit that, 3 years later, would turn her into the garden's unofficial designer, even though she never once picked up a welder herself. Over that next year, the pile that had once looked like an insult became something else entirely. A heron, built from flattened sheet steel, stood one-legged near where the cattails had come back thicker than ever, since the sunflower barrier had actually improved drainage in a strange, unplanned way. Turned out clearing that much biomass and root structure loosened compacted soil that had been packed tight since before Elias was born. A pair of deer, welded from bent rebar and old harrow tines, grazed near the fence line, positioned so that from the county road, in the right evening light, they looked almost alive enough to make passing drivers slow down. Bram brought his own scrap from projects around his property. A neighbor 2 farms over heard about it at the feed store and dropped off a truckload of old fence posts and a broken hay rake nobody wanted. Even the plant, Meridian Alloy Works, once its liability lawyers stopped circling, sent over a foreman named Daniel Princeton with a company forklift to help move the heaviest pieces into arrangement, an unofficial, unspoken apology delivered in diesel exhaust and shared labor instead of words. By the second autumn, there were 19 sculptures standing in what used to be a swamp corner nobody could farm anyway. Elias strung the fence line with reclaimed barn lanterns rewired for solar cells, another quiet nod to doing things with what the land and the junk pile could actually offer, rather than what a hardware store catalog said he needed. Here's the detail most people watching a story like this skip past, and it's worth slowing down for. The reason the sculpture garden could exist safely at all wasn't the welding. It was 2 years of unglamorous soil stewardship underneath it. Petra Dijkstra's final testing, done at the start of the 3rd year, showed zinc levels back within normal agricultural range across the entire contaminated footprint, and cadmium at levels the state considered safe for ornamental and recreational land use, though still cautious against food cultivation directly on that original footprint for at least another rotation cycle. Elias didn't plant vegetables there. He planted a cover crop of white clover between the sculptures instead, partly for erosion control, partly because clover fixes nitrogen into soil through a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria living in nodules on its roots, quietly rebuilding fertility in ground that had spent a year and a half doing hard chemical work. Underneath the clover, mycorrhizal fungi, threading through the root systems in the kind of underground partnership most visitors to the garden would never think to look for, kept rebuilding the soil's structure one root hair at a time, exactly the kind of slow, invisible labor that makes a farm and not just dirt. The sculptures got the photographs, the clover and the fungus did the actual work. By the 4th summer, people were driving out from Holland and Zealand, and even as far as Grand Rapids on weekend afternoons, pulling onto the gravel shoulder to walk the mowed path Elias had cut between the sculptures. He never charged admission. He put out a coffee can for donations to the county food shelf instead, and most weekends it came back close to full. The local Dutch Heritage Society, the kind of organization that exists in nearly every town in that part of Michigan, where tulip festivals and windmill replicas sit a few miles from dairy barns, asked if they could include the garden on their annual countryside tour. Elias said yes on one condition, that the tour also stop at the plant next door, so visitors would understand where half the material had come from, and that the story told wasn't one of a factory villain and a farmer victim, but of 2 neighbors who eventually figured out how to turn a mistake into something the whole township could be proud of. The rooster from that first 9 days still stands closest to the road. Its wings have taken on the deep, sealed, burnt orange patina of proper weathering steel now, the kind that isn't dying but has simply finished growing its own armor. One visitor that 4th summer, an older man on a bicycle who turned out to be a retired agricultural engineer from Utrecht, visiting relatives in Zeeland, Michigan, stood at the fence line for nearly 20 minutes without saying a word. When he finally spoke, he asked Elias not about the sculptures but about the clover, kneeling down to run a hand through it the way a person might greet an old friend. He said it reminded him of reclaimed polder ground back home, land pulled from under the sea centuries ago and coaxed, patiently, into something that could grow food. Elias walked him the length of the garden that afternoon, past the heron and the deer and the rooster, but it was the clover the man photographed most, 36 pictures of nothing but low green leaves and white blossoms, because he understood, better than most visitors ever would, that the real achievement wasn't standing above the ground, it was underneath it. Elias Vanderberg is not a real name, and this exact chain of events didn't happen on one single farm exactly this way. But every piece of it is drawn from something true. Farmers across the American Midwest, from Minnesota to Nebraska to Wisconsin, really have spent their retirement years turning salvaged iron into menageries of sculpture standing in their own pastures. Soil scientists really do use sunflowers and mustard plants to pull heavy metals out of contaminated ground, one growing season at a time. And weathering steel really does rust its way into something stronger than what it started as. Maybe that's the part of this story worth sitting with longest. The metal wasn't ruined by what happened to it. It just hadn't found its shape yet. Somewhere out past a fence line, in a corner of a field that used to be good for nothing but cattails, that's still true tonight.